It happened in less than 10 seconds. Donald Trump leaned forward into the microphone, narrowed his eyes, and said something so direct, so off-script, that the entire press room stopped breathing. Every camera lens focused, every pen paused mid-note. Reporters looked at one another, baffled, stunned, some even frozen in disbelief. He wasn't talking about Putin, not about Kim, not even about Xi Jinping. No, it was about someone most of them didn't expect to hear on that stage. He said the name slowly, Ibrahim Traoré. And in that instant, something shifted. Because in the sea of names world leaders rarely mention, Traoré's stands like a match struck in a storm, fiery, unexpected, and defiant. But to understand why that moment left reporters speechless, you have to know who Ibrahim Traoré really is. Not the label the Western media pins on him, not the caricature headlines throw around, but the man beneath the military uniform, the boy who once studied geology, the young officer who listened more than he spoke, the rebel who rose with nothing but conviction, steel nerves, and a nation behind him. Born in 1988 in the dusty, sun-scorched north of Burkina Faso, Ibrahim Traoré grew up watching his homeland struggle under the weight of foreign interference, political betrayal, and systemic poverty. He didn't inherit power. He didn't marry into privilege. He earned his stripes on battlefields most politicians have never seen, fighting terrorists with limited supplies, no glory, and no guarantees. He wasn't the first to lead a coup in West Africa, but he became the one that echoed far beyond his country's borders. At just 34, Traoré seized power in a move many dismissed as yet another military takeover. But what followed was something no analyst fully predicted. Traoré didn't just overthrow a government, he confronted a system. He told France to pack up. He cut ties with colonial institutions. And he spoke to his people not with polished words, but with raw, relentless purpose. So when Trump mentioned his name, when he said, "That young man in Burkina Faso, he's got guts," it wasn't just a throwaway comment. It was a statement loaded with implications, aimed straight at the global establishment. Why would a former American president say that? Why would he single out a West African military leader most of his audience had never even heard of? And why? Did the media act like they'd just witnessed a political earthquake? This is the story behind that sentence, and what it means for everything you thought you knew about power, rebellion, and the new world taking shape beneath our feet. Before we go further, hit that like button and subscribe, because what you're about to hear will change the way you see both men and the truth they're forcing the world to face, because the world wasn't prepared for what was coming next. The name Ibrahim Traoré had, until then, been confined to brief news updates buried beneath headlines about Paris, Washington, and Moscow. But what Donald Trump did in that moment, whether he meant to or not, was rip Traoré's name out of the margins and place it firmly in the center of a global conversation. And not with a speech. Not with a campaign slogan, just with one line. One sentence that pierced through decades of diplomatic silence and lit a match under every journalist in that room. To some, it sounded like praise. To others, it felt like provocation. But to those who truly understood the weight of history, the long, bloody tug-of-war over Africa's sovereignty, the unspoken alliances, the silent wars, it was something else entirely. It was a signal. You see, Traoré isn't just a military leader. He's a symbol of everything the West pretends it doesn't fear. A young, educated, unapologetically African man who didn't wait for permission to act, who didn't bow before the so-called powers of international diplomacy. He looked at the failing strategies around him, foreign troops stationed in his land, foreign aid wrapped in debt, terrorism spreading faster than hope. And he did what few dared to do. He said, "Enough." And he didn't whisper it. He shouted it in his actions, expelling French troops, ending military agreements that had lingered like chains, calling out Western hypocrisy while turning to other global players, not out of desperation, but out of strategy. Some called it dangerous. Others called it bold. But the people of Burkina Faso? Many of them called it freedom. That's why Trump's words hit so hard. Because it wasn't just what he said. It was who was saying it. A former U.S. president known for his bluntness, his rejection of political correctness, his willingness to call out weakness where others bite their tongues. When he spoke of Traoré having guts, it wasn't just commentary. It was alignment. However brief, however subtle, it was the kind of moment that sends ripples through diplomatic circles and thunder across social media. But it also raised deeper questions. Was Trump drawing a parallel between Traoré's fight for independence and his own battles with the American political machine? Was he admiring a fellow outsider, one who challenged the elites and refused to follow their rules? Or was it something even bigger, something that hinted at a shift in how power is recognized in this new, chaotic world? Whatever it was, the silence that followed told its own story. Not a single reporter dared to follow up. No hands were raised, no clarification asked. Just that stunned, uncomfortable stillness that always comes right after someone speaks a truth no one expected to hear out loud. And that was just the beginning. Because as that quote circled the globe, reactions exploded. Online, in newsrooms, in government halls across continents. Some tried to dismiss it, others leaned in. And somewhere, far from the podium lights and American microphones, a young African president likely heard those words and knew exactly what they meant. So, buckle in, because this isn't just a headline. This is the full story behind that single sentence, and the two men it tied together in ways no one saw coming. And to truly understand the gravity of that moment, you need to trace the path that brought both men, Donald Trump and Ibrahim Traoré, to that silent intersection of power, defiance, and global consequence. Let's start with Traoré, the son of a modest family in the Sahel region, born into a country already burdened by instability and foreign influence. His upbringing wasn't surrounded by privilege or elite connections. He grew up in a nation where children memorized the names of warlords before they learned those of authors, where schools were sometimes silent because bullets spoke louder. But even in that noise, he listened. He learned. He watched. He earned a scholarship to study geology at the University of Ouagadougou, where he could have chosen the quiet life, scientific research, government service, a distant existence from conflict. But that wasn't his calling. The reality around him was too raw to ignore. Extremist violence surged, corruption festered. French troops came and went, but the chaos never left. Villages were burned, civilians massacred, and the ones in charge offered only speeches, never solutions. That's when he joined the military, not for glory, but for change. And unlike many officers who climb ranks through allegiance, Traoré climbed through results. He led operations in some of the most dangerous areas in Burkina Faso, earning a reputation not just for strategy, but for humility. He ate with his soldiers. He walked where they walked. He bled where they bled. And when the government faltered again in 2022, when the people cried out for real leadership, it was Traoré they trusted. He led the coup at just 34 years old. No propaganda, no pageantry, just purpose. And he didn't waste time. He promised security. He promised integrity. And then, most notably, he promised liberation. Not just from terrorists, but from foreign control. That's when the world turned to look. And halfway across that world stood Donald J. Trump, a billionaire-turned-president who rose to power on the promise of disrupting everything. Say what you will about Trump, he doesn't do half measures. He challenged the press, reshaped alliances, and redefined what political loyalty looked like. His presidency shattered norms, baffled analysts, and stirred fierce loyalty from millions who believed he was the only one brave or reckless enough to say what others wouldn't. And that's the connection. Two men, two continents, both vilified, Both praised, both defiant, both deeply misunderstood. Trump may not have known every detail of Traoré's rise, but he recognized something familiar in the young leader's audacity. He saw someone standing alone against a system, refusing to play by the rules written by people far from the fight. And in that brief moment, on that stage in front of those stunned reporters, he acknowledged it. He didn't endorse a coup. He didn't explain. He simply said what he saw. That young man, he's got guts. And with that, he shattered the usual silence surrounding African resistance. Because, let's be honest, leaders like Traoré are rarely spoken about in the West unless they're being condemned. Yet here was Trump, dropping his name into global conversation not as a villain, but as a force. The moment was over in seconds, but its aftershocks are still traveling. Analysts are still dissecting it. Allies are still trying to explain it. Opponents are still pretending it didn't matter. But it did. Because sometimes the most important words aren't long speeches. They're short sentences that open forbidden doors. And in that one sentence, Trump did exactly that. Now the question is, what happens when the world walks through? The room eventually moved on, but the internet did not. Within minutes, clips of Trump's words began circulating across every platform: YouTube, Twitter, Telegram, TikTok. Some thought it was satire, others double-checked transcripts, but it was real, raw, unedited. A former U.S. president acknowledging a man the mainstream had tried to box in as dangerous, unstable, or worse, irrelevant. And across the ocean, something else was happening. In Ouagadougou, the capital of Burkina Faso, the mention of Traoré's name by someone like Trump didn't go unnoticed. In neighborhoods where power outages were frequent and streets still bore the scars of past protests, a different kind of electricity surged through the people, not because they craved American approval, but because recognition, real recognition, is rare for African leaders who defy the Western script. You have to understand, Burkina Faso is no stranger to foreign intervention. For decades, its people have watched their leaders cater to the whims of outsiders while their own villages crumbled. From coups to puppet regimes, the nation has known the taste of betrayal all too well. That's why Traoré's message, sovereignty, unity, dignity, hit so deeply. He wasn't selling a vision crafted abroad. He was restoring one stolen long ago. And now, his name had been spoken by the very figure who once sat in the most powerful office on earth. But what made that moment so haunting wasn't just what was said. It was what it forced people to admit. That a young African soldier who wore no suit, who never dined in Davos, who rejected IMF handouts and turned down Western troops, was now being talked about in the same breath as world leaders. That a man who came from the dry plains of West Africa had disrupted the conversation from a continent so many choose to ignore. Donald Trump didn't go into detail. He didn't lay out foreign policy. He just said what the press wouldn't dare, what diplomats wouldn't whisper, and what his audience didn't expect. And that one sentence cracked something open. The media scrambled to frame it. Some called it reckless. Others tried to downplay it. Trump praises a coup leader, they said, as if that was the story. But it wasn't. The story was why that line felt like a bomb in the room, why a simple observation carried the weight of buried history and unspeakable truths. Because here's what no one wanted to confront: that the world is changing. That the old rules, where power spoke only through approved mouths, where leaders were chosen by silent consent of global elites, are breaking, and men like Traoré are the proof. He doesn't speak like a polished statesman. He doesn't read from pre-written Western scripts. He talks of sovereignty, sacrifice, and dignity, not in theory, but in action. And for people in the West who've grown numb to empty politics, that kind of leadership, however messy, feels authentic, even threatening. So when Trump said he's got guts, maybe it wasn't about support. Maybe it was about recognition. The kind that doesn't need approval, only honesty. Because deep down, everyone in that room knew what made them uncomfortable wasn't that Trump said something controversial. It was that, for once, he said something true. And the truth, once spoken out loud, has a way of spreading faster than any denial can contain. What Trump did, whether intentional or instinctive, was shine a light on a growing fracture in global power. A split between the voices that shape the narrative and the voices that shape reality. Between the polished leaders who talk of freedom while funding oppression, and the unfiltered ones who rise from hardship with no permission, no polish, and no patience for games. Ibrahim Traoré doesn't fit the mold. That's exactly why the mold fears him. He's not backed by billionaires. He's not a media darling. He doesn't do photo shoots in branded humanitarian gear or stage-managed summits with photo ops and press lines. He stands in fatigues, surrounded by villagers, speaking in the dialects of his people, calling for the return of Africa's resources to African hands. And most dangerously of all, he means it. That's what Trump saw. A leader who wasn't asking for the world's approval, but demanding his people's survival. Someone who, in Trump's own language, wasn't weak. Someone who acted, who fought, who said what others wouldn't, and stood by it when the world turned its back. And that's when the real fear sets in for those who've spent decades choreographing geopolitics from glossy boardrooms and air-conditioned embassies. Because when a man like Trump, who built his platform on calling out that system, publicly recognizes a man like Traoré, the illusion of control slips, even just a little. It tells people watching, especially the youth in places like Ghana, Nigeria, Congo, and Senegal, that they're not invisible, that someone outside their borders, someone once called the most powerful man in the world, sees what's happening, and maybe, just maybe, agrees with it more than he's supposed to. That's why the silence was so loud in that press room, because no one had a prepared response. There was no pre-written fact sheet, no talking point to recycle. It was a collision between two unpredictable forces, one standing behind a podium in the U.S., the other walking through villages in West Africa, but both, in their own ways, defying the structure that keeps the powerful comfortable and the forgotten quiet. And when those two forces collide, history tends to listen. The reaction wasn't just digital. Within hours, international media began scrambling to reframe the moment. Op-eds appeared overnight, some painting Trump's remark as dangerous flirtation with dictatorship, others cautiously analyzing Traoré's popularity among Pan-African youth. Fact-checkers tried to soften the impact. Headlines danced around the quote. But they couldn't erase it. Because once a name like Ibrahim Traoré is said out loud on a platform that large, it can't be unheard. Once it leaves the mouth of someone like Trump, it can't be ignored. It starts to matter, even to those who wished it didn't. And that's when people began asking the deeper question, not just why did Trump say it, but what did he see in Traoré that others missed? And that question is where the real story begins. Because buried inside that question is a truth neither side wants to fully confront, that the world's center of gravity is shifting, and the men triggering that shift are no longer wearing tailored suits or sitting at long, polished tables in Brussels or D.C. They're in fatigues, walking barefoot among farmers, eating with soldiers in tin-roofed barracks, and talking directly to people who haven't seen peace in decades. And in Burkina Faso, that man is Ibrahim Traoré. When Traoré took power, the first thing he did wasn't to promise reforms on paper. It was to walk the bloodied roads his predecessors refused to. He visited zones the government had all but abandoned. He didn't hide behind security. He faced his people, dirt on his boots, and gave them something they hadn't had in years: presence. That, in many parts of the world, is more powerful than any speech. And it wasn't just his presence. It was what he said, that Burkina Faso would no longer be a doormat for foreign militaries, that Africa's youth weren't born to be statistics on refugee boats, that sovereignty meant something, not in theory, but in practice. He closed borders to external manipulation, expelled foreign troops, canceled exploitative mining contracts, and when Western diplomats warned him of the consequences, he stared them down and moved forward anyway. That's the part people like Trump recognize. Not the method, but the message. The willingness to be hated by the powerful in order to be heard by the forgotten. Trump built his political identity by punching upward, by calling out institutions that millions believed were rigged, by tapping into rage, frustration, and pride that had been ignored for too long. And though their backgrounds are wildly different, one a New York real estate mogul, the other a West African revolutionary, their instincts are strangely aligned. Both refuse to kneel. Both call out hypocrisy. And both trigger the same reaction from those who built the system they're now disrupting. It's no coincidence that the same press corps that rolled their eyes at Trump flinched when he mentioned Traoré. Because what they heard, what they really heard, was the crumbling of a narrative. A quiet admission that the world isn't just being shaken from within, but from places the establishment hoped you'd never pay attention to. And the timing couldn't have been more dangerous. Because Traoré's message isn't staying in Burkina Faso. It's spreading to Mali, to Niger, to Guinea. Young people are watching, not just in Africa, but in France, in Brazil, in the U.S., and they're not asking for handouts. They're asking why they've been sold a system where independence was only symbolic and prosperity was always exported. So when Trump, accused of being anti-establishment, praised for being brutally honest, names Traoré and gives that rare nod of acknowledgement, it's not just a passing moment. It's a signal that there are cracks in the old power structure. That recognition, whether intended or not, is being extended to a movement the mainstream refuses to legitimize. That someone who once controlled American foreign policy is now, however briefly, validating the defiance of a man who's throwing a wrench in the post-colonial machinery. And that's why the media froze. Because no one had the script for what happens when someone like Trump says the quiet part out loud. And when the quiet part is finally said aloud, it doesn't just echo in the room, it detonates across the global narrative. The press room's reaction wasn't confusion, it was fear. Not of Trump, they were used to him. It was fear of what his words might unleash. Because once you legitimize a man like Ibrahim Traoré, even with a single sentence, you ignite something far more uncontrollable than applause or outrage. You ignite curiosity, and curiosity is the one thing propaganda can't contain. People began to ask, who is this man Trump just spoke about? Searches for Ibrahim Traoré surged. Videos of his speeches circulated. Footage of him walking through conflict zones, not flanked by 20 bodyguards but surrounded by villagers who embraced him, began to trend. Clips of him addressing his military with resolve, not reading from a teleprompter but speaking from memory and conviction, were shared not just in West Africa, but in black communities in Chicago, London, and Johannesburg. The veil had been lifted. What had been hidden under headlines and Western briefings was now being re-examined by millions. And what they saw didn't fit the story they'd been told. Traoré wasn't a dictator. He wasn't a warlord. He was young, poised, thoughtful, fiercely nationalistic, and deeply loved by many in his country. And more importantly, he was effective. He was doing what leaders in suits had failed to do for decades: confront the real causes of instability, not through donations, not through diplomatic jargon, but by refusing to be a pawn on someone else's chessboard. That's why Trump's words landed like an explosion, because the world has long been taught that power only exists in predictable places, that real leadership must be polished, predictable, acceptable to the global elite, that the rest, especially from poor countries, must be dismissed as chaos or populism. But then along comes Traoré, walking proof that leadership can emerge from the ashes, that order can come from defiance, and that respect doesn't have to be granted by foreign powers. It can be earned from the streets. And Trump saw that. Whatever you believe about Donald Trump, you can't deny that he has a radar for strength. He's drawn to those who operate outside the establishment, who break the rules, who don't seek validation from traditional sources. In Traoré, he saw a mirror, not in style, but in spirit. A man who was willing to absorb criticism, international scorn, and the wrath of elites. For one thing, the people he vowed to protect. So when he said, "That young man's got guts," it was more than admiration. It was a quiet salute, from one disruptor to another, and that's why the silence was deafening. Because the press knew what had just happened. They knew Trump had just opened a new front, one they weren't ready to cover. He'd pulled Traoré out of obscurity and placed him, without warning, into the Western consciousness. And once that happens, there's no going back. Now, people are watching, listening, questioning, not just what Trump said, but what it means for America, for Africa, and for a world that's starting to turn away from the old order and look toward the fire rising in places no one was supposed to notice. And when people start looking where they were never meant to, something irreversible begins. They begin to connect the dots. Why is a man like Traoré being portrayed as dangerous, while corrupt leaders with Western approval are labeled stable allies? Why does a call for African sovereignty provoke such outrage in European capitals, but silent approval for puppet regimes provokes none? Why does a former U.S. president, known for turning establishment norms upside down, point to a 30-something captain in West Africa and say what no one else will? The answer is uncomfortable, because it reveals a truth so few want to accept. The global order isn't built on peace, it's built on obedience. And Traoré? He refuses to obey. He doesn't bow to the IMF. He doesn't ask for NATO's permission. He doesn't send his country's gold to French banks while children in his own villages starve. And, more importantly, he doesn't pretend. That's what makes him dangerous to the system. And that's what makes Trump's words so explosive. Because Trump, knowingly or not, validated authentic defiance. He didn't just mention a name. He cracked open a forbidden conversation. What if real leadership now lives outside the polished boardrooms? What if the men wearing dusty boots instead of Ferragamo shoes are the ones who are actually moving history? That possibility terrifies the status quo. You see, the old world depends on predictability, on compromise, on leaders who will say the right things in public and surrender everything in private. Traoré? He's the opposite. He says the quiet truth in public and acts on it in full view. And Trump, for all his flaws, recognized that pattern. He didn't need a memo to see it. He's lived it. And when a man like Trump nods at a man like Traoré, the message is clear, even if it's wrapped in only 5 words. He's got guts. Those words traveled faster than missiles. They crossed oceans, skipped headlines, and lodged themselves in the minds of millions asking, why aren't our leaders standing like that? Why do we have voices that tremble when speaking truth, while men like Traoré stand unmoved under pressure that would break most? It forced a comparison no one was ready for. And when comparisons begin, so does change. Because now, youth across Africa aren't just cheering a name, they're seeing a path, not a perfect one, not an easy one, but a real one. And the West, they're watching too. They're realizing that power no longer flows in one direction, that influence can rise from the very places they dismissed, that one bold sentence, said in a moment of honesty, can shift the conversation from scripted politics to raw, unfiltered truth. So no, what Trump said wasn't just a compliment. It was a warning, and maybe a prophecy. Because if the future belongs to those willing to face the storm, then Ibrahim Traoré may already be holding the first torch. And the world, it just blinked. But blinking isn't enough anymore. Because once the torch is lit, the shadows it casts can no longer hide the fractures beneath the surface. The questions grow louder, the silence more unbearable. What happens when more leaders stand up like Traoré? When more people refuse to accept the world as it's been handed down, when the margins of history push forward into the center. This isn't just about one man. It's about a movement, a restless, rising demand for dignity and self-determination that no amount of spin or sanctions can suppress. And that is why those few words from Donald Trump reverberated far beyond that press conference, because they marked a shift in awareness. A fracture in the story the world has been told for decades, the story where power only belongs to those with titles, money, and international approval. The story where African leaders are either saints or villains, but never complex, never real. The story where voices like Traoré's are whispers, not shouts. But now, with a single sentence, that story has been cracked wide open. And the silence that followed wasn't confusion. It was fear. Fear that a new chapter's being written. One where courage, conviction, and a willingness to disrupt the status quo become the currency of true leadership. That's the story you don't hear on the evening news. But it's the story shaping our world behind the headlines. And it all started with a sentence from Donald Trump about Ibrahim Traoré that left reporters speechless, and the world wondering what comes next. From this moment on, the narrative can no longer ignore the forces reshaping global power. Traoré's rise is a symbol, a challenge to the old guard that thought it could dictate the future from distant capitals. Young people in cities like Ouagadougou, Lagos, and Kinshasa are tuning in, inspired not just by words but by action. They see in Traoré a reflection of their own frustrations, their own hopes for a leadership that fights for them, not for foreign interests or fleeting alliances. Meanwhile, Western governments scramble to recalibrate. Diplomatic cables are rewritten. Policy briefings filled with buzzwords now try to grasp the raw realities that men like Traoré embody. The old scripts no longer fit this new chapter. And the press? Some continue to paint him as a threat, others cautiously explore the nuances of his leadership. But all are forced to reckon with the fact that their coverage can no longer exclude voices that resonate deeply across continents. Because power is no longer centralized. It's dispersed, decentralized, and unpredictable. It lives in the boots of soldiers walking their homelands, in the voices of leaders who refuse to bow, and in the hearts of millions demanding change. The question now is simple. Will the world listen? Will the global conversation shift from fear of disruption to embracing a new era of leadership? Or will it cling to the familiar, even as that familiarity crumbles? What Donald Trump said about Ibrahim Traoré was not just a sentence. It was a signal. And signals, once sent, are impossible to take back. The future is being written, and the pen is in hands that refuse to be silenced. And those hands, steady, calloused, determined, are gripping more than just the pen. They're holding the weight of generations, the scars of colonization, the cost of betrayal, and the fierce, unshakable desire to be free. Ibrahim Traoré didn't ask to be a symbol. He didn't rise through polished institutions or beg for endorsements from world powers. He rose through fire, through the collapse of systems meant to keep him obedient, through the ashes of promises that never came true. And now he stands not as a politician, but as a reminder that real change doesn't come in a briefcase. It doesn't walk softly. It arrives with conviction. It speaks without apology. When Trump spoke his name, that moment cracked the shield of silence that had kept Traoré in the shadows of Western discourse. That crack let in the light, and with it the questions no one wanted asked. Why are leaders like Traoré feared more than tyrants who sell their people for foreign aid? Why do nations that preach democracy get uncomfortable when others demand sovereignty? Why is the idea of Africa rising, truly rising, still treated as a threat instead of a triumph? And now that the future has spoken, the world must decide how to respond. No longer can nations play ignorant, pretending Traoré is just another name in a region they've long neglected. No longer can the media reduce him to a soundbite, a headline, or a talking point about instability in Africa. That script is worn. The audience isn't buying it anymore, because Traoré, by simply refusing to kneel, has revealed a far deeper truth. Africa is no longer asking for permission. And when Trump, a man who disrupted the political foundations of the United States, recognized that same energy in Traoré, it set off a chain reaction the world wasn't ready for. What was supposed to be a minor moment in a press conference has now become a beacon, not because Trump planned it, but because the world is ripe for truth. And the truth, in its rawest form, doesn't need polish. It just needs witnesses. And that's exactly what we've become. Witnesses to the rise of a different kind of power, one that doesn't need global approval to be real, one that doesn't wear suits tailored in Milan or speak the language of think tanks. It speaks the language of people, the wounded, the betrayed, the dreaming. And in that language, Traoré is fluent. He's not a perfect man. No revolutionary ever is. But perfection was never the point. Courage was, conviction was, and the willingness to lose everything rather than live as a pawn. That was. So when Trump said what he said, the reason reporters were left speechless wasn't because they didn't understand. It was because they did. They understood that a new alliance was forming, not of governments, but of mindsets. That two men, wildly different in background, had recognized the same enemy, a system that punishes independence. They understood that millions watching would start to ask dangerous questions, the kind that lead to change, the kind that light fires, the kind that rewrite textbooks, and in their silence we heard everything. The fear, the discomfort, the recognition. This wasn't supposed to happen, but it did. And now something far greater than political theater is unfolding. It's generational, it's emotional, and it's irreversible. Because once a people see the chains, they don't forget, and once a leader breaks them, others follow. So let the world watch. Let the doubters whisper. Let the headlines twist. The future has already answered, and it's speaking with the voice of those who never had one. This is bigger than a name, bigger than applause or outrage. This is the shift, and history will remember exactly when it began. Because history, real history, doesn't unfold in grand speeches or red carpets. It erupts in moments like this. Quietly at first, unexpected, unscripted, a sentence here, a stare there, and suddenly everything changes. That's why this wasn't just Trump making an offhand remark. This was a crack in the global mirror, a reflection that had always been carefully crafted, suddenly showing a different image, an image the world wasn't prepared to face. An African leader standing tall, commanding attention and refusing to be ignored. A Western leader acknowledging it, not with caution, but with clarity. And a global audience, stunned into silence, realizing they'd just witnessed something historic. That's what makes this different. This wasn't the usual choreography of politics. This was raw, unfiltered, real. And once the real appears, the polished performances fall apart. You could feel it ripple through the room that day. The reporters fumbling for follow-up questions they didn't dare ask. The advisors glancing at each other with the unmistakable look of, did he just say that? Yes, he did. And the silence that followed wasn't confusion. It was recalculation. Because those in power suddenly realized, if Traoré is recognized by voices that millions respect, then he's no longer just a local leader. He's a global figure. And that makes him dangerous to the old world order. That makes him unstoppable to the ones who believe in him. And across Africa, not in the newsrooms but in the streets, the schools, the barracks, that recognition felt like a spark. A moment that whispered, "You're not alone anymore. The world is watching." The world heard his name, and now they can't unhear it. From that day, something shifted. Not just in politics, not just in Burkina Faso, but in the story the world tells about power. Because if Ibrahim Traoré can rise, if he can command attention and respect without bending to anyone, then the illusion is broken. The illusion that true leadership must come from somewhere else. The illusion that greatness must be sanctioned by the West. Now, that illusion is fading, and in its place, a new reality is emerging. A reality where courage speaks louder than credentials, where the people, not the press, decide what kind of future they want. And now that the rules have changed, the system doesn't know how to respond. The usual tools, discredit, isolate, ignore, don't work anymore. Because Traoré didn't seek their approval to begin with. And Trump? He doesn't play by their rules either. Together, even if, for just a moment, they shattered a decades-old script designed to preserve the illusion of control. The world saw it. The people felt it. And the elites, they panicked in silence. Think tanks began drafting quiet memos, questioning how to contain the narrative. Analysts tried to spin the moment as uninformed or off-topic. But the damage had been done. Something fundamental had shifted. Something no amount of backtracking could erase. Because this wasn't a policy announcement. It was a signal to the world's forgotten and underestimated, "You are no longer invisible." That was the power in Trump's words. That was the danger in Traoré's name being spoken. It didn't just echo in the chambers of power. It roared through the places most leaders refused to look. The slums, the villages, the classrooms without electricity, the soldiers without pensions, the farmers without land. All those who've been told to wait, to hope, to obey. And suddenly, someone who looked like them, who sounded like them, was being acknowledged. Not as a problem, not as a threat, but as a man with guts. And if he could be seen, so could they. It was never just about Traoré. It was about what he represented. Defiance without shame. Leadership without permission. Power without apology. That's what made the reporters go silent. Not because they disagreed, but because deep down they knew it was true. They knew the game was changing, that the new players weren't interested in asking for a seat at the table. They were building new tables, and setting them on fire when necessary. And those who thought they could gatekeep global leadership suddenly realized, the gates are gone. The keys don't matter. The people are walking in anyway. So now the world watches. Some with awe, some with fear, all with curiosity. Because when Donald Trump, the most disruptive voice in Western politics, says the name Ibrahim Traoré, the question is no longer who he is. It's what happens next. And when history looks back on this moment, it won't remember the silence in that room. It will remember what that silence meant. The moment the old world lost its grip, and the new world took its first breath. That breath, quiet but unshakable, is still expanding. Not in boardrooms or embassies, but in the minds of everyday people. Young soldiers polishing their boots before dawn, school teachers under tin roofs, fathers who've buried too many sons to broken promises, mothers who've raised entire families without the help of a single system that cared. They all heard the shift, and whether they admit it or not, so did the elites. They heard the tremor in Trump's voice, not of hesitation but of certainty. The kind of certainty that doesn't need footnotes or teleprompters, the kind that cuts through spin and lands in the gut. That's why the silence wasn't just professional discomfort, it was existential dread. Because in those 5 words, he's got a lot of guts. Trump didn't just praise a foreign leader, he exposed a wound the Western press and its partners have tried to bandage for decades, that they, for all their influence, have lost the moral authority to lead. And worse, they know it. They know that courage in its truest form isn't found in perfectly curated speeches or well-staged photo ops. It's found in moments like Traoré's, when a man stands against empires and says, "My people come first." It's found when you tell the truth and accept the consequences, when you act before you're accepted, when you walk into history without asking for permission. And now, the cracks in the system are no longer theoretical. They're visible. In Washington, where foreign policy advisors whisper about African unpredictability. In Brussels, where diplomats scramble to explain why former colonies are rejecting their influence. In Paris, where elites wonder how they lost control of a region they once ruled. And in Africa, where the people are no longer looking up for approval. They're looking around and realizing they're no longer alone. That's what Trump ignited. That's what Traoré represents. A global realignment, not of economies or alliances, but of values, where power is no longer granted, it's earned, where leaders aren't chosen for their eloquence, but for their backbone, where legitimacy doesn't come from foreign capitals, but from the streets. And in that realignment, something irreversible has happened. The world has seen a glimpse of what leadership could be, and it won't go back to pretending. Because now, the people have a new standard. Not perfection, not politeness, but guts. And from the moment Trump spoke, that standard stopped being local. It became global. So let the analysts write their think pieces. Let the critics scramble to reframe it. Let the old guard cling to their fading script. The truth is already out, and it's moving faster than they can contain it. A single sentence. A single man. A single moment of honesty. That's all it took. And now the story has changed. For good. And that change is no longer theoretical. It's alive. It's moving through conversations at border checkpoints and village gatherings, across WhatsApp threads and late-night arguments between young revolutionaries who, for the first time, feel like history might finally lean their way. The machinery of the old world still churns. Sanctions, headlines, PR statements, but the gears grind louder now, warned by disbelief. Because no matter how much they try to minimize Traoré's name or dismiss Trump's words, they can't unring the bell. That bell echoed across nations. It rang in dusty towns where people tuned in on flickering radios. It rang in inner cities and remote hamlets, not as noise, but as confirmation. Someone noticed. Someone said it. And suddenly you were no longer alone in your suspicion that the world was upside down. Because that's what Trump's remark really did. It didn't just praise Traoré. It validated millions who've long known the truth but were gaslit into silence. That real leadership doesn't kneel to money. That true courage doesn't beg for applause. And that sovereignty isn't a gift. It's a birthright. This terrified the world's gatekeepers. Because when sovereignty starts becoming popular, their control becomes outdated. For decades, the West dressed up domination as diplomacy. They offered aid wrapped in conditions, elections managed with influence, and peace kept at the barrel of imported weapons. All while telling Africans to wait, to develop, to mature, to be ready. But Traoré didn't wait, and Trump, whether he intended to or not, validated that decision. And now, what's emerging is a new global psychology. One that doesn't beg for validation from former empires. One that doesn't apologize for protecting its own. One that refuses to accept that leadership must come pre-approved by Davos or Brussels. This is why the silence of the press wasn't just awkward, it was revealing. Because they weren't just stunned by what Trump said, they were stunned by what it meant. That someone like Traoré, who refuses to play the global game, might actually be winning. And that winning isn't measured by Wall Street reports or think tank metrics, but by the will of a people who feel seen for the first time. So what now? Now, the conversation has shifted. Now eyes that never looked toward Burkina Faso are watching every move. Now, leaders across Africa are being measured not by their resumes, but by their resolve. The rules are different. The masks are off. The silence has spoken. And what began as one man speaking another's name has become a movement of voices demanding the world listen. Because in that moment, something rare happened. The truth got loose. And the world is still trying to figure out how to contain it. But the truth, once loose, doesn't go back into its cage. It spreads, it multiplies. It moves through places that official statements can't reach. It crosses borders without needing a passport, and it burns through the carefully constructed narratives that once held entire nations in place. And in this new reality, the silence of the press is its own confession. It's not that they didn't have something to say, it's that they didn't know how to say it, without unraveling everything they've spent years building. Because to speak honestly about Traoré now would mean admitting that the people they once labeled as radicals, rebels, or militants were, in fact, fighting for dignity. It would mean revisiting every story that painted Africa as a land of chaos instead of resistance. It would mean acknowledging that the very systems they defended are the ones that failed. And, worst of all, it would mean relinquishing control of the narrative. That's why Trump's words hit so hard, because unlike the polished pundits and cautious diplomats, he just said it. Blunt, raw, unfiltered. He's got a lot of guts. No disclaimer, no footnote, just a simple, undeniable truth that a young African leader stood up to giants and didn't flinch. And in doing so, he forced the world to confront a possibility they never prepared for. What if the future doesn't come from the centers of power? What if it comes from the margins? From a country they overlooked, from a captain they underestimated, from a people they thought would stay silent. Now, nothing feels secure anymore. Not the alliances, not the assumptions, not even the media's grip on what global leadership looks like. Because with 5 words, Trump opened a door, and Traoré walked right through it, with millions behind him. And here's the part no one dares to admit. Deep down, even the reporters, sitting there in that press room, gripping their pens, rehearsing their questions, felt it too. The shift, the unease, the moment when the script they were handed no longer applied. Because when truth crashes through the room, it doesn't matter how well you rehearsed your talking points. You either acknowledge it, or you stay silent. And that's what they did. They chose silence. But the people didn't. They never do. They took that silence and filled it, with questions, with defiance, with new stories of their own. And now, across continents, a different kind of conversation is happening. Around dinner tables, on radio shows, in barbershops, classrooms, and refugee camps. The question is no longer, can Africa lead itself? It's, why were we ever told it couldn't? And the answer is starting to echo in the voices of a generation that has no interest in waiting for permission. Because something irreversible has happened. A name was spoken, a truth was confirmed. And the silence that followed wasn't the end of the story. It was the start of one. And now, that story is being written not by diplomats or journalists, but by the people themselves, brick by brick, word by word, and step by step. In Burkina Faso, children are learning that their president isn't just a man in a suit, but a soldier who put his life on the line for them. In neighboring countries, youth movements whisper about Traoré not as a distant leader, but as a symbol that maybe, just maybe, it's possible to break free from the cycle. He's become more than a president. He's become a message that says, you don't have to be what they told you to be. And that message, once released, is uncontrollable. It spreads through stories passed in markets, through songs on motorbike radios, through defiant prayers spoken under flickering candlelight. It has become the anthem of the disillusioned, the proof for the doubters, and the fuel for the next brave soul who chooses conviction over comfort. That's why the press froze. Because if they acknowledged what had just happened, if they leaned in and explored the weight of Trump's words, they would have had to open a door they've kept sealed for decades. A door behind which lies everything they've denied. That the global South doesn't need saviors. That Africa isn't waiting to be developed. That leaders can rise from the soil, not from elite academies or global clubs, but from sacrifice, pain, and raw purpose. Traoré's story is proof of that, So is Trump's comment. And the reason the world shook is because deep down, we all know. Once people realize their leaders don't have to come with Western validation, they'll stop listening to the ones who do. That's the real fear. That's what echoed in the silence of that press room. Not just shock, but a quiet, dawning realization. They've lost the monopoly on truth. And now the world's eyes are shifting. Not upward, but outward. Toward voices that have been speaking this truth for years, but were ignored. Toward nations once seen as unstable, now viewed as unshakable. Toward leaders like Ibrahim Traoré, who refuse to be defined by anyone but his people. And the conversation has changed forever. The next time a Western journalist prepares to write about Africa, they'll remember this moment. The next time a political analyst scoffs at so-called military leaders, they'll pause, because they'll know, somewhere out there, is a leader with guts, and a people who've had enough. So let them stay silent. Let them play catch-up. The world has already moved on. The truth is walking now, and it doesn't need a press badge or a podium. It just needs space, and that space has already been claimed. And that space isn't just symbolic anymore. It's real. It's physical. It's spreading. You see it in the flags waved by schoolchildren who never knew their country could stand alone. You hear it in the chants of soldiers who no longer see themselves as pawns in a foreign game, but as guardians of something sacred. You feel it in the silence of international institutions. The same institutions that once moved swiftly to condemn, to intervene, to steer. Now they hesitate, because the usual tools, shame, pressure, isolation, don't work on someone who isn't playing their game. And that's what Traoré's rise has revealed. A whole generation of leaders, quiet, steady, watching, who were never seeking to be accepted. They were preparing to be understood. And now they are, thanks to a single sentence that sliced through layers of media conditioning, geopolitical bias, and colonial hangovers. Thanks to a moment no publicist could polish. Thanks to a silence too loud to be misheard. Trump said it plainly. He's got a lot of guts. And in doing so, he did something no think tank, no press briefing, no carefully worded policy paper could ever accomplish. He gave legitimacy to a man the system wanted erased. But the people saw it. They felt it. And they remembered. Because Traoré's strength doesn't come from his title. It comes from the way he carries the weight of those who have nothing but hope. From the way he walks straight into a storm with no backup but his own conscience. From the way he doesn't flinch when told to wait, to bow, to compromise. And now others are watching. Not just in Africa, but in Latin America, in Southeast Asia, in the Middle East, even in parts of Europe and the U.S., where people are beginning to question whether their leaders have the same kind of courage. The courage to break away, to speak plainly, to defend their people, not their positions. This is bigger than one name. It's a signal that something new is rising, something that can't be bought, something that won't be silenced, something that doesn't need headlines to matter. And while the world scrambles to reframe the narrative, to soften the edges, to dilute the moment, it's already too late. The people heard it, they believed it, and now they're acting on it. So this wasn't just a moment on camera, it was a warning to the powerful, and a promise to the powerless. That truth, real, unpolished truth, still has power. That conviction still matters. That guts still mean something. And from this moment forward, the world will speak about leaders like Ibrahim Traoré, not as side notes in someone else's history, but as authors of a future no one can stop. And that silence? It was the sound of the old world cracking. It was the sound of something ancient being reborn. It was the sound of a tide turning. And once it turns, there's no going back. Because when tides turn, they don't ask permission. They don't knock on the doors of empires. They crash through them. And that's exactly what this moment has become. A crash, a rupture, a reckoning, a reminder that for all the polished suits and global summits, Real power is still rooted in something much deeper than money or media. It's rooted in sacrifice, in conviction, in the willingness to be hated for doing what's right, instead of loved for doing what's easy. That's what Traoré brought back into the conversation. And Trump, for all his controversies, all his unpredictability, has a strange gift for sensing that kind of raw courage. He doesn't always say what the world wants to hear, but sometimes he says exactly what the world needs to confront. And when he uttered that line, he's got a lot of guts. He wasn't just talking about a man. He was talking about a mirror held up to every world leader hiding behind bureaucracy, to every think tank that confuses strategy with morality, to every media outlet that's grown too afraid to call power what it really is. And in that reflection, people everywhere saw the question they've been too scared to ask. What if we've been following the wrong kind of leaders? What if courage doesn't wear a tie? What if honor doesn't need a press release? What if change doesn't come with a signature, but with a stance? That's why the silence was deafening, because for the first time in a long time, the establishment didn't have a script ready. They weren't prepared to applaud, because they were never meant to acknowledge. They weren't prepared to criticize because they knew they'd be exposing their own hypocrisy. So they said nothing, and that nothing said everything. And while they remained still, the streets didn't. From Ouagadougou to Lagos, from Nairobi to Port-au-Prince, the streets are moving. They're talking. They're asking the questions the press won't. Why is Traoré feared? Why is he attacked for putting his people first? Why is courage a threat? And, more importantly, why did it take Trump to say what no one else would? That's the dangerous part. Not that Trump said it, but that millions agreed. Instantly, viscerally, without hesitation. Because truth doesn't need credentials. It only needs to be heard. And now that it has been, the world has entered a new phase. A phase where silence isn't safety. It's complicity. Where inaction speaks louder than analysis. And where every leader, everywhere, must decide, will they serve the people, or will they serve the script? Traoré chose his answer. Trump, in that moment, affirmed it. And history will remember that. Not as a gaffe, not as a controversy, but as a spark. The spark that lit a fuse. And once a fuse is lit, you don't argue with it. You get ready.